Our session today is on entrepreneurial urban politics, and it grows directly out of what we've seen in the earlier sections of the course. You've seen bits of this here and there. The main readings are three: The New Political Culture, Trees and Real Violins, and the Norquist book, The Wealth of Cities. Norquist was the mayor of Milwaukee, and then after that, he became the director of the Congress for a New Urbanism, where he did these same things nationally and internationally. And it was a movement of planners, architects, policymakers generally, and it's a program of policies such as destroying freeway exits in Milwaukee so you don't have cars, not letting the cars come into Milwaukee. To have a city that big say no in that dramatic way was a pretty dramatic statement. But then the city of Seoul basically destroyed the whole freeway going right through the middle of the center. And so it was dramatic illustrations of how these policies can be changed if the mayors want to. Bogota, Colombia, they said if you have a license plate on your car that has an even number, you can't drive Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, and vice versa. So half the cars could not drive in Bogota just like that if you want to change it. So most cities, especially in the U.S., who love their cars, but also same thing in India, in China, in many other I should qualify. There is an India-China difference, which is important. The Indians basically are following the 19th century British garden city planning program of saying greenery and trees, and don't build any high rises more than 3, 4, 5 stories. What's that mean? Fantastic congestion for cars. The Chinese have been much more high-rise oriented. So Shanghai is the most visible example. Huge skyscrapers, higher than anywhere else in the world. Massive growth, but also massive growth of cities of millions of people. So the populations of both countries are growing, but India has billions of, millions and millions of little villages, small towns, low density. China has more high-rise cities, and it's a much more density, low environmental impact style. New York City has the lowest amount of consumption of gas and energy of any city in the U.S. by far. So density counts in that sense, and the Chinese have gotten that message. And even though they are not the highest country in terms of income and education, they're jumping ahead faster by trying to learn from the countries that are higher in income and education. Okay, so these are sort of the NPC themes which fit in with the style. The second big one is diversity. So the diversity issues: women's concern, human rights, environmentalism, gays and lesbians lifestyle, more tolerance generally. These issues today are called the core of, and of course, African American treatment in the U.S., but ethnic minorities in India, which go much further than the U.S. in affirmative action. These have been around since the 70s, basically. Major issues, they came in. And so how can diversity, which has now gone further in some respects, but not in others. It's a very hot issue in the US now in arts organizations and universities, women's organizations. Wen Miao talked about feminism in China. This is the sort of a 21st century version, but these really began, and that's why we're looking at this closely today, because this directly links globalization, diversity, and these new sets of rules which inform the other things that we've been talking about. So we talked about changes in the dependent variable, in the second session. The first section was the market. Second session was new social movements. How do these things work? Diversity, all these issues are surrounding us right now, for sure. So we gave you more description there, but we didn't have that much of an interpretation. Now this is one of the foundational components of an interpretation, of looking, because we had 20, 30, 40 years of experience with these things. If we look at the individual issues going back historically, where did they get onto the programs of different political parties, different policies get implemented, and how do these vary cross-nationally? And thus, what kind of programs and concerns might we learn from these in discussing diversity issues as we have new combinations, especially locally? So the national differences work if you have national homogeneity, but the more you've got differentiation within a country, the more you've got to look at the local or the neighborhood to get a sharper sense of what the causal patterns are. Because if you look at the national data, as I say, this is one of the major sources of my point, you know, being a woman, being rich, being highly educated only explains a little bit of voting for Hillary Clinton. Okay, that is, the majority of white American women in the first election, white college educated American women, majority voted for Donald Trump. You don't hear that in the media. So there's diversity. Now, was it based on feminist issues? That's a harder question. Maybe those women were voting more on economic issues of lower taxes and against Donald Trump's, maybe they would have opposed Donald Trump's feminist issues. But my point is, we get mixes of these if we look just at the names of the candidates or the parties. But so these things are not black and white, they are complicated. And so that's why we need these different things to teach, these different examples in context to try to tease them apart. Okay, let's do so. So we've got the simple story and then the more complicated story. Let's get the simple story out first. The big simple story is the rise of income and education, long term. Linking that immediately to politics, we also have simultaneously, after World War II, the drop by half in the number of manual workers. So blue collar workers were major foundations of the leftist parties, socialists and communists, especially say in a place like Italy, where the communists and parts of France less so, but Italy, the communists were very strong. And in the context of the Cold War, the communists were scary to many of the Italians, just to take one extreme country. This led many Italians who were not necessarily strong, fervent Catholics, they still voted for the Christian Democratic Party because they didn't want the communists to come to power. And they were afraid of the degree to which Bologna, which was a communist city and which had strong international support from the Russians, this was seen as a serious threat. After, that is the international linkages for the Italians. After 1989, when the Berlin Wall went down, what happened in Italian domestic politics? The Communist Party died in terms of its support because people said, we're not afraid of the Russians anymore. We're not afraid of the communists because the Russians are not going to back them. Therefore, we're not going to vote for the Christian Democrats or the communists. So the whole party structure collapsed, not because of domestic Italian issues, but because of global issues, transforming the whole party. So you now have 30 parties. In Poland, after 1989, in the first election after 1989, there were 200 parties and social movements running for office in the National Assembly. The Poles went wild. You safe sex party, a beer drinking, friends of beer drinking, etc. So all kinds of wild social movement groups created little splinter groups. Then they boil themselves down to some degree, but you still have 30 or so in Italy. Okay. And they're having a hell of a time creating anybody who can create any majority right now in the last week. Okay, so the cross-national difference. All right. Let me show why Italy's so important in more specific context, analytically and cross-nationally with specifics. The 1970s, as I mentioned, the two strong parties were the communists and the Christian Democrats. Socialists were in there too. The new movements began to emerge, especially with 68. So the student movement revolution, the two big dates I've talked to you about often are 68 and 89. 68 was the student revolution in Paris and Berkeley and Columbia. And this featured student power, decentralization, participation, and some of these new social movements issues. But it was especially an anti-hierarchy in the US anti-Vietnam War and the university totalitarianism. That term was used to refer to hierarchical paternalism, the male chauvinist pig of the family, etc., in the strong rhetoric. Okay, so so I mentioned as well, 68, Daley was the classic tough blue collar union leader, and he led they beat up the students and the activists outside the Chicago Democratic Party National Convention. 4 years later in Miami, Daley and the unions were basically excluded. And you had a program of strongly activist, feminine-dominated themes, which took over the party, and we had a co-chair of the required of all Democratic parties in the United States. And so Jane Byrne became the co-chair of the Cook County Democratic Party. And I talked about her as an independence. Okay, so that if we think of her as an example of how did she get elected? She ran on the beginnings of reform issues. She ran against the traditional Democratic Party style, even though her background was as co-chair of the Democratic Party herself. So that in that sense, it was like Trump. She ran on issues which she didn't necessarily believe in. I won't say that. I mean, that's too strong a statement. But the point is, soon after she took office, she did the opposite on many of these things which she'd campaigned on, and was seen as hypocritical by many African American activists and others. Especially began protesting, and in the next election, there was her next election was between, that is, in the next election, Richie Daley ran against Jane Byrne. Daley too. Both are Irish Catholic. They divided the Democratic Party vote among the Catholics. Harold Washington then was being proposed as a candidate, and he won because the white Democratic traditional ethnic vote was divided roughly 50-50 in Chicago. So Harold Washington, 33 1/3 and 1 vote practically in the primary. Because he won the primary in such a Democratic city, he won the general election. New York City, just another quick example. Manhattan is doing these things we're talking about, much higher levels of education and income than the rest of the country. and it's on the New York Times all the time. Was there who might not have supported these kinds of issues in the 5 boroughs of New York or in the general area? Did all 5, and one way to put this, we were studying the 5 boroughs because we have county level data and within the 5 boroughs, so we can contrast the 5. We're doing this for years. Which borough voted for Trump? Sorry, yeah.
Staten Island, I believe.
There we go. Okay, one person. Did the New York Times tell you that? Barely. Barely, okay. So why is Staten Island so different? What's its politics? What's its ethnic background? What's its tradition in the 19th century?
It's primarily conservative politics. A lot of largely Italian population there. A lot of firefighters and municipal workers in that background.
Okay, firefighters, municipal workers, yes. Conservative is a tricky label. The key issue, I would say, is more socially cautious, or at least if not outright conservative, but in contrast to Manhattan. But yes, the Democratic Party, in terms of ethnic background of the Democratic Party from the 1930s, that is the Tammany Hall was a mixture of ethnic groups. But in the 1930s, the Democratic Party became led more by which ethnic group in New York? The Italians, basically. And the Jews were dominant in the Union. So there was a split between the Jewish and Italians. And okay, I don't want to go on to, but in a sense, the unions became more intellectualized. The New York Times, you have that with the Manhattan intellectual moralism. Also anti-corruption, anti-clientelism. Staten Island was clientelist, classic Italian clientelist, which you get in China, which you get in France, which you get in Italy. And so, so many Italians came to Staten Island, worked, made tomatoes, went back to Italy, and then carried on active in national Italian politics in the 19th century. Okay, they kept shipping money from Staten Island and back to Italy. So there are interactions here. So I'm featuring Italy a little more for reasons we'll see as I go on. Luke?
Yeah, Professor Clark, you got a question in the chat.
Okay.
Before proceeding.
Okay, go ahead, chat. Let's speak up, someone, or read it to me.
Sorry, this was me. I didn't want to
sure,
interrupt
no
train of thought. I asked you to elaborate a little bit more on the Catholic vote and how messaging or branding by a particular candidate may cause it to become split. What are some factors specifically geared towards the Catholic vote that cause that?
Yeah. Okay. Good question, and it's a general enough question. Let me take it right now. It's a major factor for Chicago. That is, I'm contrasting sometimes as you get so much coverage in the press, New York, Chicago, and LA. I've sometimes simplified to say the migrants to New York, the urban Jewish migrants from Poland went to New York. The rural Catholic migrants came to Chicago from Poland. The number one ethnic group in Chicago in the 19th and 20th century was Poles, Polish Catholics. Did they govern alone? No. they had a hard time getting majority. They came from fighting against the Tsar. They didn't speak English. They ate Polish food. They were not politically savvy. Who was politically savvy at the time? The Irish. So the Irish and the church coordinated the Catholic vote in Chicago in ways that the Italians, the other leading large ethnic groups were the Italians, the Poles, some Germans, but the Irish, even though there were only maybe 6% nationally of the U.S. population, not all that much more in Chicago, but the Catholics were the majority. So since about that is, Chicago in the 20th century has never had more than about 15% of white Protestants in the city. Chicago's a Catholic city. The whites are Catholic. And then after World Wars I and II, the African Americans, and then especially say the late 20th century, the Mexicans increased in numbers hugely. Mexicans, some degree Puerto Ricans, but basically the traditional Protestant whites are much more numerous of the three cities in Los Angeles. So if you want to see more of the white Protestant, this is downtown LA versus the more Jewish film industry in Hollywood, Beverly Hills, and so forth. Culturally, I don't want to press this too much, except that I was teaching at UCLA, and a student said, "How come we have so much anti-Semitism in the film industry?" And I said, "What?" And so I got a guy to come from the film industry and tell the UCLA students that it wasn't a WASP establishment of capitalism. Okay. So and the books on LA politics play up much more explicit Black, Jewish conflicts in ways that is not true in Chicago. Okay, all right, so that's a quick answer. I have a paper I mentioned as well called the Irish Ethic and the Spirit of Patronage, which elaborates this in about 70 pages. So it's a background element which is included in these others. But let's push on with the more general NPC themes for now, and we can return to that as you like. So the simple way of summarizing the NPC is that it brought together. Well, let me give you the diagram here. I will switch forward to this, which you've seen before. This is. Okay, factors driving toward a new political culture. Economic, social, and cultural. This is very close to what we also use in the Scenescapes book, but that plays up more the cultural components. But in terms of the economy, decline of agriculture and manufacturing, rise of high-tech information services, higher incomes, general affluence, reduced tensions among income groups. Other things equal, more market individualism. That's first week of the course. Social factors, the slimmer family, decline of the extended family, weakening of family links to education and occupation, individualization, illustrated by families going to restaurants, 3 or 4 family members using their cell phones during the whole meal. Okay. Cultural end of absolutes, the decline of the quest for Cartesian certainty and Newtonian mechanisms, the rise of great relativity, hermeneutics, pragmatism, constructivism, Picasso, Einstein, cultural pluralism, diversity as tolerance, diversity not just as an activist social diversity of let's say, women and African Americans, but a broader cultural diversity of seeing the whole world in these more relative terms. So in China, where ethnic politics is not salient, you can still have the same kind of cultural pluralism emerging. Or Scandinavia, which until recently was ethnically very homogeneous. Okay, within government, up at the top, the more developed welfare states have, quote, solved the most urgent problems of, say, massive unemployment, the differences between the Great Depression and the recessions of the period afterward are massive. These combine in the new political culture. Okay, so that story you've seen quickly in earlier discussions, and I'm putting them together here now. Any quick, this is a general version, and in the NPC book, there are about 21 specific propositions about how these work in specifics, derived from 3 more general propositions, which are the hierarchy proposition that is which is called the leveling principle. That hierarchy tends to lead to anti-hierarchy. This then in turn, the empowerment proposition, that as people get more educated, especially more cosmopolitan, more connected through social media, this in turn tends to lead to more participation in civic and cultural groups, and they tend to have more impact, weakening political parties, strengthening the media, strengthening political leaders who fight against the traditional parties, whether they're Donald Trump in Washington or Lori Lightfoot in Chicago or Macron in France, who variously, I mean, they're not pure cases, but they're fighting against the traditional parties, I'm stressing here. And so Macron, analogous to the Italian transformation, Macron basically destroyed the whole French political system in one election, and his people, his new party, trumped the classic conservatives, the communists, the National Front, and the socialists. And so he's got a huge majority. But basically, my point is, Macron is closer to these NPC issues in that he's socially liberal, but fiscally cautious. And that's the style which became, which was not recognized. My quick point here is this wasn't recognized at all as a political culture. It was seen as queer in both senses, and off the wall. Who can be doing this? So when the first mayors who were doing this, get one more. Yeah, okay, let me stick with a couple of these PowerPoints and then I'll go on to from them. Yeah, okay, let me make a quick summary. The simple way to the simple way to summarize this is to say that the new political culture is socially liberal on women's issues, gays, African Americans, ethnicity, religion, culture, socially liberal, but fiscally cautious. Not necessarily conservative, not as conservative as Reagan and Thatcher, but the examples were Bill Clinton and Tony Blair that most visibly brought this to global attention. And so how can you possibly reconcile this combination in specific policies? If you want to help the disadvantaged, help African Americans, help women get ahead, and yet you don't want to have a big, strong socialist state controlling the economy, what can you do? You can, I mean, the simplest logical answer is increase productivity of government. Do more of those things, or use or find ways that civic groups may do the same kinds of things. So the huge stress, I mean, who invented the internet? was the Clinton administration. That is, things like, think of the internet, of how massively that has increased productivity in the entire world and how it's changed all kinds of things. Computers, so technology is having a massive impact. And that relates to, of course, the decline of manual labor. So as we have within the economy, half the people working on using their strong shoulders. Chicago was the city of broad shoulders. We were a blue collar city. That's no longer true. We're the city of, we knock on the door, City Hall. What's the number one economic foundation of Chicago today? Entertainment and tourism, restaurants, sports, concerts. So the summer festivals bring in millions of people. We showed you that with the quick overview images. Tourism is the largest industry in the world, or third largest, depending on how you do the accounting. Tourism is a dramatic new activity which wasn't there because people didn't have the leisure time, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the communication. Chinese, Japanese tourists are here. Look at the bicycle path, 12 months of the year. They're divvy bicycles with all kinds of visitors from Chicago. Many are Asian families walking as you look at okay, etc. So, so the simple social liberal fiscal conservative may lead to productivity, at least as a commitment. Is it actually fully implemented? Of course not. But it's a political, ideological way of rationalizing the two. And as examples where it might not just be an abstract commitment, but an actual policy, I mentioned appointing of new federal judges by Bill Clinton. That is, if you don't increase the budget for the federal judges at all, you have the same number, but you dramatically increase the numbers of women and African Americans and others who are not just of a political party, but of social background that changed. Okay. Productivity, more specifically, the internet. Think of that. Okay. Let's push on then with some more specifics, and just one quick link to, as well, globalization. And this is going to be in, let me stop the sharing. I'll turn this on again and get screen share. And this time I want this one. And I'm going to show you this. Okay. Whoops. Yeah, what do you have in your screen now? Does it show national differences? No. Okay. I did something wrong. Let me tell me what it says on the, where, no, let me stop the screen share. Let me put this on the, okay, what's that say now? National differences in types. Okay, let me go back to the earlier one here. And so remind you of this, which you had a hard time reading before. Here's Tocqueville, line 1, civic participation leads to trust and legitimacy. But the Asian cases, they don't work. Civic participation does not necessarily build trust and legitimacy in Korea, China, Brazil, Portugal. But still, this is the bigger theme of Putnam. All of this activity of civic organizations is going down. Doesn't this lead to a drop in the whole pattern of legitimacy? And what's going on here? So our quick answer was, Look at the change in cultural organizational memberships. Hey, Putnam, you missed this. So there's a huge increase in the arts. So that can be a potential driver if it's linked the right way. And so here we have where we have you make this bigger, the new political culture framework. This is stressing what about the whole context of the world leads to more of this globalization and with other changes. These are more national system changes and then affected by globalization. So let's look at the box. The end of the Cold War and the general global peace, the decline of major tariffs and trade barriers, rise of global trade, new modes of communication, fax, internet, fiber optic cables, digitalization, expansion of education for citizens in many countries, decline of agricultural industrial work, rise of more professional, service-oriented, increasingly technically based jobs where computers and machines. Okay, so these are key components. What do? They lead to, this is the positive side, they lead to the new political culture. The classic left and right are transformed. Social and fiscal economic are explicitly distinguished. The rise of social issues, this is the diversity program, combined with fiscal issues, but issue politics generally, more citizen participation, decline of the hierarchy, market individualism and social individualism grow, etc. Okay, especially among younger, more educated and affluent individuals and societies. So conversely, if we look at the top, what is there in many cities, neighborhoods in many countries? We still got strong parties. We still got class politics. We still have ethnic groups. We still have a national government emphasis for some and clientelism. And we still have for some class politics, rich versus poor. So we have these in the candidates that almost won 4 and 8 years ago in the US, and I'm bringing in, the battles being, for instance, between Trump and the mayors. I mean, he was continually arguing against these big city Democratic mayors are clearly not Trump supporters. In Japan, for example, all the biggest cities have all lost their domination of the major LDP political party. So the clientelist traditional left-right parties have lost in among these subgroups. In local elections, you can see changing. Okay, how can we see this even more precisely? We don't have data on this for the more recent things. We just got names of mayors, and that's loose. But with the FAUI project, the Fiscal Austerity and Urban Innovation Project, we've been doing this for 30 years. We've got lots of data on 10,000 cities. And we've asked questions of individual mayors and council members, what positions, now we don't just say what's your party and what's your name, we say what are your policy positions on higher spending for, would you like to spend more, same or less on education, this and that. I mean, a whole range of things, including things which may be more helping the disadvantaged and minority groups, and thus contrasting the social welfare from the more general policies. And what do we find in terms of, okay, so first big point here, how can we say we have in terms of the title of the section, an entrepreneurial mayor? How do we have a mayor who's different? One simple measure is to take the national party program of each mayor, and parties are much stronger in Europe and Japan than they are in the US. If we take the strength, we take the position of the mayor within his or her party. And so we take all those fiscal items. Are you in favor of more or less spending? Then we have social items. The social items include sex education in school and abortion, two hot issues. So if we, those were the main FOWI items. So if we use those and we then say, what's the position of the individual mayor on these for each of thousands of mayors within Italy, within France, within the US, and then say, how many of these do we have? The answer is we got lots of them in the US. I mean, mayors are all over the lot in the US. You have Republicans, Democrats who are in favor of more spending, less spending, all kinds of stuff. So by contrast, the Europeans know, I mean, traditionally, let's say a couple of decades ago, the strong parties really were the major drivers of, that is, they didn't have, there are no primary elections in Europe. There are no primary elections in almost all the world, except for the US, Mexico, Taiwan, traditionally. They're now coming in a little bit more, but they're very seldom held. How can we then capture this? If we go beyond what I just said, and what we did was to compute a measure of the degree of fiscal, the fiscal position of the national party. We take the average for all the mayors in France, all the mayors in Italy, all the mayors in Australia. And then we say, how does one individual mayor match or not match the national position on the fiscal issues and the social issues? If you as an individual mayor are far from your national party, we define that as the NPC, is being entrepreneurial. Okay. So we have a measure of the degree to which the individual mayors differ from their national party. We then look at the degree to which these programs get implemented in various ways. Just to give you one more quick example of how this works in terms of implementation of diversity policies. And we have a table which shows whether we have the percentage of women council members and whether or not there was a female mayor. So electing women in 15 countries. This is on page 157. So the interesting question is, how strong are these, and which countries? These are simple correlations, which simply says which countries have more women. And Canada, Sweden, Britain are very high. They're 0.4. So Britain was 0.42. US was only 0.22 for percent women and percent council members. For women mayors, it was 0.11. Okay, the next step though, so women have been elected, but where and why? And we get two simple patterns, which are more careful analysis shows. You can take a look at the book to see the details, but the basic point is in the US, you tend to have more women mayors and council members where you have more highly educated citizens and more active civic groups leading in a feminist direction. Is that true in Italy? Is that true in Britain? Is that true in Poland? No. How did all those women get elected mayor or council members in Italy and Britain and Poland? The left parties chose to appoint them. The Communist Party of Italy said we have PR elections. We can appoint anybody we wanted because you vote for the party, not for the name of the person. You don't get to choose whether it's a woman or not. You only can vote for the Communist Party. So the communist cities seated women as half of the city council members. Tony Blair brought in more women than ever, but there's a whole chapter on these oppositions. But the blue collar men in places like Liverpool, they didn't want women, but they still said, shall I vote for Labor? Lots of them said, I'm not going to vote. So you have non-voting, but you also nevertheless had the new Labor Party of Tony Blair coming to power and seating more women in the British Parliament than ever before. So this was a general pattern that outside the US with its distinctly weak party structure, and I'll add Canada and Australia similar, the parties were key players. So looking at what the parties did to make these things, to make policies like diversity get implemented is a critical thing to do. National differences in parties are big here. And so I'll just say in a sentence, we can come back if you want. The Italians and the Spanish embraced Eurocommunism. What was Eurocommunism? Women, human rights, globalization, environmentalism, and not just the proletarian revolution. Why and how did they embrace this? It wasn't an easy thing to do. The environmentalists and the others went to the Communist Party and the socialists in earlier on and said, why don't you add us to your program? And they said, never, we're the party of the blue collar revolution. But as the numbers of those blue collar voters kept going down, and then what did the activists do? In Italy were the most dramatic. They dynamited trains. They assassinated a former prime minister. They kidnapped political leaders. They killed professors. They were violent terrorists for about 3 or 4 years. Same thing in Germany. Then the political opportunity structure, that's the label we used earlier to summarize this, changed in the parties of the left said, okay, we do need these social issues. And they embraced them in Italy and Spain, but not in France. So the French Communist Party stayed Leninist all the way through. The Italians are a major interesting change in having some of the most hierarchy and clientelism openly, but they changed when they were pressed, and so we got more of this diversity cross-nationally and within countries. Okay, lots more on that, but I'll stop there for the moment on that diversity theme there. I want to let you ask questions, so I'm going to keep this brief and just flag briefly that what I'm talking about with cross-national examples, I introduced in part with New York and Chicago. I mentioned in particular, and let me put one way to illustrate this dramatically for Chicago is to say, where did this really come from? Where did this really come from and get implemented in Chicago? Harold Washington. Because the two Irish candidates split the Catholic vote, Harold Washington won the election. As he was campaigning, his own father had been a Democratic precinct captain and active in the traditional Democratic Party. Harold Washington had run for mayor 2 or 3 times before, and he'd gotten one, he got no votes as a traditional Democrat. His speechwriter and campaign manager was Bill Grimshaw, with whom I've been doing this oral history for a couple of decades. And Bill wrote a speech where he included mention of reform. And when he talked about that and a little bit of reform activities, the crowd went wild, say, yes. And Harold then talked to Bill and said, what do they mean? What's this reform stuff? Harold Washington had no clear reform program when he was chosen by the party, but he adopted it as things went on, and he became the most important implementer of reform politics in Chicago's history. Daley, too, followed Mayor Washington with a black face more than his own father in his politics concerning reform, at least in public. So as I've said, he had his HBO, his Hispanic Democratic Organization, where he did some traditional party stuff. But he would say again and again, I want to embrace reform. We want to use culture. We want globalization. We want visitors. And so he was doing these policies very visibly at the same time that he had He had elements of so people who didn't know about the topics could say, yeah, I'm voting for him because he's Irish and because I'm a Catholic, and I support he looks like his father, so maybe he's the same, but he was not. And he laid the way and he fought with the Democratic Party. The traditional party leaders opposed Daley too. They did not want him to come to power. He was too much of a threat from his name. So they fought him. That's why he created his own HDO. Okay, so basically, this is still battleground going on in different neighborhoods and within Chicago. Each ward has its own politics, and so we can find terrific, interesting variations within Chicago and see these kinds of patterns in individual cases, as many students have done papers illustrating these in years past. Let me stop there for a bit as I'm talking, and I can bring in and elaborate any of these points. But I've given you the big overviews and some. Let's see. Do we still have? There's screen share up here. Okay. Yeah, I'll stop the screen share. Okay. Questions and discussion. Max.
Yeah, so I'm curious if we would how we understand the character of the recent conservative movements, which seem to revolve around similar points as the MPC, but in an oppositional fashion. There's a lot of anger towards multiculturalism, that being a center point of Trump's campaign, and a lot of use of identity politics, but in an oppositional way from recent conservative movements. Is this a new kind of political culture that has formed in opposition to MPC? Is it another side of the new political culture? How do we understand these new dynamics?
Okay, excellent point. Right on to note the empirical fact, which I completely agree with you on, that we have a lot of stuff that does not fit what I've been presenting right here. And yes, I would agree with your second point that this is an open, explicit opposition to the many aspects of the NPC, illustrated most visibly by Trump's introduction, saying all those Mexicans are rapists. So he was breaking explicitly with the social liberalism in a powerful way, which had become, and here's the follow-up critical point. I didn't have time for this, but we have 7 books on this new political culture. That is, the NPC book with the title gives you the theory and has evidence from cross-national comparisons and general discussions around the world. We have 7 other books which look at specific themes, such as the breakdown of class politics, book with Marty Lipset, and how the parties changed and how class, as I described it in the Italian case, in the Euro-communism case, led to and the same thing with Daley being excluded from the Democratic Party. The bottom line of that was the blue-collar workers no longer supported the left. And that meant no more class politics the way it had worked in the past. The new proletariat was who? Students, intellectuals, artists, media people. But they were the avant-garde in the 70s. Since then, and since the 68 revolution, how many people support these kinds of views? Let's say simply defined as socially liberal, tolerant on abortion, tolerant on women's issues, tolerant on sex education, and not necessarily too high spending. Roughly 50 to 70% of all citizens in Western Europe, the US, Canada, and Japan. That is a huge majority of citizens. This is his second book. called Citizen Politics and Post-Industrial Society. We looked at citizen surveys, a whole book just on citizen surveys. And basically the citizens all moved in this direction based on the big drivers of education, income, et cetera, although varying by country. Poland and Ireland are partial exceptions, for instance, for historic specific reasons of those countries, et cetera. But the point is then, as this became not just a new political culture followed by a small minority of mayors, it became a dominant view with Bill Clinton and Tony Blair and Mitterrand in France, for instance. With this happening, we then had the emergence in France. The most dramatic case is the rise of the National Front. So the National Front was an openly anti-immigrant, openly racist party. So the father, I mean, right at the beginning, the father of the woman who ran quite successfully against Macron, but when he would give speeches and say, we don't want these Black Africans in our cities. They have lower IQs and they will depress the quality of the whole educational quality of France. I mean, he was openly racist in those kinds of terms, in ways that the National Front then attracted a certain number of voters. Second quick answer, the National Communist Party in France was openly, communist and socialist parties were tolerant, egalitarian. Everybody's equal, everybody should have equal rights. But locally, they were not, especially the communists. With public housing, massive public housing was a major driver of who lived where. And the communists had the support of the so-called Red Belt outside Paris. Those Red Belt mayors were anti-immigrant. And that is part of that's the historic background, a lot of the conflicts with the Muslims to today, that they're aware of this open sort of anti-immigrant, anti-French traditional past. Another way of putting this in a bottom line is, let me stay more closely to your question and the answer. The simple answer is, yes, indeed, we have the emergence of not just Donald Trump, but different versions of this NPC, such as the populist side of saying citizens we want, but these liberal leftist civic groups, we don't. That's Donald Trump. That's Brazil. That's Philippines with the national presidents, and the evangelist Christians are major activists in Brazil. So we have we have bits of this, or put another example. The more highly educated, so Sweden has no tradition of ethnic conflict. So you had feminism easily came in and easily, in a sense, took over. I won't say took over, but let's say the left party, socialist especially, embraced equal opportunity concerns for women, and I think half of all women employees of city governments had to be women at one point. So basically, the Swedes started to do this and had a lot of support from women and from the Greens. The young Swedish men said no. And those young Swedish men 20 years ago were similar then to the National Front in France, the Republicans in Germany. So the general point I'm making is every major European country had an anti-immigrant party. Your anti-immigrant politics is an old European pattern for 20, 30, 40 years. Europe is not an immigrant society, the European countries. So even though they had a lot of immigrants from Eastern Europe, and elsewhere, they culturally refuse to acknowledge that. Their national languages, their national culture, their conceptions are at least halfway. I made the point comparing to Asia. This is controversial, I know, but the Asians see this, land and race is much stronger. The Europeans are in the middle. The US is the most extreme, where instead it's ideology. You can learn to be an American if you just memorize the dates in the history books of when was Abraham Lincoln, or what did, learn about the Gettysburg Address and a handful of things, and you can be an American citizen. In France, you can live a whole generation, and you could never become a French citizen. Your children could become French, but you could never vote. And so part of that led to the stronger was part of the stronger anti. Okay, so in brief, I'm saying yes, we have national differences. They're in part related to party-specific combinations of ideology in ways that differ from country to country and city to city. If we look more closely, within Chicago, within New York, within LA, and so the Staten Island point is an excellent simple example. Okay, so that's my quick answer to the question. What if we let others maybe? I mean, we could elaborate this or others, but any other themes that I've touched on, which or just let me conclude and say what we have today is a mixture of all of these things going on. So when I gave the presentation in the social movement section, I talked about these 6 kinds of things going from feudalism, which brought us slavery in the US, onto industrial society, which brought us the proletariat versus the managers, those simple capitalist conflicts, to civic groups, which could bring in the ethnic groups and others, to the new political culture, which we're talking about now, and the new social movements, which fit. So the new social movements of women, environmentalists, they fed directly into the new political culture, clearly. Then the new social movements, which do not. The new social movements are populist, and you then get Trump trying to appeal to these new folks who don't fit. So who were the people who stormed the U.S. Congress? We don't know. That is, it was not, my point is, it was not the Communist Party. It was not a Nazi party. There is a Nazi party in the U.S. You can look at members, but they're very small. I mean, and so the point is, it was messy, and given the messiness, it's harder to generalize and interpret, and so we get low adjusted R squares when these things there are lots of different things going on, and so you need to get down to things like cities and neighborhoods, and then perhaps you can geographically begin to, or concrete individuals. And so looking at biographies of individuals and thinking in your own background, thinking about your own parents and grandparents, where and how do they fit or not, and why, is a way to try another way to try to test propositions, in addition to having systematic things like multiple regression to do so. Okay, who else has a question? We had 1 or 2 hands up there. I think Ram, anybody else have a hand up?
Yeah, I guess to maybe build on this point that we're talking about in relation to parties and the NPC, I'm wondering if maybe the 2-party system in the United States, which naturally veers towards less fringe areas than something like a proportional representation system, which is more likely to have something like an extreme far left or an extreme far right, would the 2-party system then be more conducive to something like the NPC, which kind of has like a mix of this centrist ideology?
Generally, yes. Yes, I agree with most of what you're saying. The centrism, and one way to say that Putnam in his book on Italy has a good figure. He has on one page, he has sort of a normal distribution with the degree to which Italy was not a normal distribution in the 1940s. That is, it was much more of a flat, even kind of thing like this, with both the left and the right having more. I mean, communists and the strong Christian Democrats had more votes. Over the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, the Italian voting pattern looked more and more like a normal distribution. So even though the main dominant parties did not change from the 40s to the 60s and early 70s, they became, that is, the proportion of centrist voting in that way led to fewer votes for the communists and they had fascists, they had other neo-rightist parties inside Italy, and they got fewer and fewer votes. So yes. Second, what it also means is if we look not just at the parties, but what's critical for the US, as Tocqueville reminded us, look at the organized groups and which are they and how do their dynamics work. And so that's why we got into the section with Putnam on bowling alone, but we don't want to look literally at bowling groups. We want to look at all different kinds, and what Putnam and many left out is, and if you just create an index of everything, you get messy stuff. So that's the one other slide. Let me see if I can quickly bring this up for you. This is what I didn't get to, but it's right here. Whoops. We have the globalization slide. Whoops, no. Yeah, okay. Is this changing on your screen too as I scroll down? Or not, maybe I've got to click on this thing. Here we go. Okay, we now got national differences in types. Is that showing? Okay, so this has got just a little more detail than I showed you before. China, France, and the US. What's the biggest group in the US? Religious. We are a religious society. France, no. We are a secular society in France. China, we are secular. Minimal religious groups. Number two, arts, culture, or no, arts, music, and education. That's number two in the US. Nope, no, I'm confusing. Political, no, I'm sorry, that's 689, 1398. Now that the US is political party, after that we see, these are levels, these are not changes. So we get, these are levels, and changes are important to look at separately. So the change is the rise in the arts in the US, but the level is not still as high as the parties. China, France. So my point of this is we got important differences cross-nationally, but the key thing is to look at types of organizations. And in the US, where we have the US and England more, in England, US, Australia, where you have more of a two-party type system, you tend to have you don't have PR, you don't have the fringe parties. The civic groups play a much bigger role in terms of funding. And so the Sierra Club has more money than the Democratic and Republican parties combined. The Association of Helping the Birds in England has more money than the British Labour and Conservative parties, et cetera. So in this sense, these dynamics and then how they work are why we talked about the third sector as a critical part of this overall kind of story. And then of course, the decline of labor unions. And is this everywhere? No. You get places like Chicago where unions are still very strong in the city in general, but weaker, and of course at the state level, New York, Illinois, very strong state level stuff where of unions, but and so with Biden as president, this becomes more complicated because he comes from a strong Irish Catholic union background And that's his conception. That's a New Deal Democratic Party conception, classic, traditional. But he's trying to bring in the new diversity themes in his appointments and in discussion of women and discussion of the environment. So how this will get worked out is a fascinating thing to watch, not just with Biden, but then with how this will connect with things locally and with different subgroups. But if we only had Biden and one national government, it's much harder to distill causal dynamics. You can't do a multiple regression with one case or with 20 countries. You need 10,000 cities to really break this down and be able to get more variation. So high on this, low on that. This is illustrated by these differences in types in China, France, and the US. Follow up on that, Ram, or anybody else who wants. These are key questions which you're asking. I'm sure they're on everybody's minds, but I haven't had time thus far to elaborate. But I can on any particular aspect that you want me to. Norquist, just in a word. Well, no, we've got the Wednesday session, so we can continue this for two sessions. So we don't need to finish everything right now. But it's good to get. We can have more discussion of any of these themes and focus it on specifics in ways that you'd like to hear me do so. If you want to put in questions or things you'd like to hear more elaborated, that we've got a lot more that and you can read some more of this stuff, and then we can talk more on Wednesday. But other themes that we might want to talk about now or more on Wednesday. Anybody from Staten Island? No, okay. So the tricky question, and this is still highly controversial, of course, is how much of the presidencies of Trump or the presidents of Brazil or the Philippines, how much does this populism so-called come from the same sources as the new political culture after 1989? And that's dramatically contextual specific. So we've got some general propositions about the rise of egalitarianism, the rise of moral. I'm also added to that moral application of moral concerns of the average person to politics. Those are big drivers internationally. But where and how moral gets defined in Northern Europe, in New England, it has a sort of New England puritanical root going back to Salem, Massachusetts. That's totally absent in China. That's totally absent in Italy. And so we get very different conceptions of what's right or wrong. And the background in Italy is the Catholic Church. And so you get a sense of Catholicism in a secular way. The majority of Italians do not believe that there's an afterlife. They don't believe in God or Christ, that Christ was the Son of God and so forth, but they still go to church together. There's a strong family where father and son and daughter and mother, and so they all go to church on Sunday, not all, but compared to France, in France, nobody believes in God and nobody goes to church. Old ladies go to church alone. And they're empty. They have some tourists, some foreigners, and then I mentioned, of course, the Putnam book on American Grace, who's showing that finally we're getting a change in this European secularization direction, only after the mobilization of the more conservative evangelical side politically, which in turn drove out from all religion, to simplify, college students in the US. So there's a secularization of college students in the last 20 years, 15, 20 years, which never existed before. The Europeans, in the European context, this took off after 1945. So the 1930s and 40s, I mean, the Europeans were still pretty religious, and so they had Christian democratic parties in Germany and Italy and so forth. They took those names because of the pillar foundation of the church, but no more. I shouldn't say no more as much. Clearly, religion, the religious foundations are still the foundations of civilizations all around the world. So the Hindu template is still there very powerfully in India, even if people may not be actively looking just for theological reasons, but they still can use Hindu religion to fight the Muslims in politics with the Hindu party in power in India. Okay. So as you hear, what I'm trying to convey in each section is get the simple argument. NPC is social liberalism combined with fiscal conservatism. The policies are do it in ways that work. Productivity, the internet, computers, these work powerfully. These have destroyed the need for half of the labor force of manual work. Half of that whole labor force is gone. Their children, the grandchildren of those blue collar workers, they're you. You're surrounded by your colleagues. They're going to college. We have a highly, but then I'll add, of course, we have a highly stratified system of universities and colleges, highly meritocratic system, which the Italians do not have. They have a much more rigid, standardized university. Everybody can get in, but if you get a high school degree, but there's a conception that Italy is corrupt, even if clientelism is still so strong, even if the political parties have grown, and you go into a post office, you wait in line, there'll be 12 people waiting in line to buy stamps, and 2 people will be gossiping to each other and visibly sort of not waiting on you. So you can get this in a US post office as well, but it's much more visible. And those people have traditionally, the culture for that kind of snub the client, snub the average citizen. That's what the Italians and the voters for Larry Lightfoot, and this part of the populist reaction is against the authoritarian and clientelism, which has made this so successful politically in the past. All right, we're at 5:30. We'll have some office hours briefly today. Think of more questions and read a bit for Wednesday, and we will pursue these themes then. Thank you, folks.